The Great Reset. The 2020 U.S. election will determine the fate of the whole world. George Soros. It has been 160 years since our last Civil War. It has been 81 years since the start of the last World War. Either way, we are long overdue for one or the other. Both of these great tragedies acted as a reset of sorts. The Civil War reset us from these United States to the United States, while World Wars I and II reset or terraformed the global stage from nationalism to globalism. In fact, the main thing that held back globalism during the 20th century wasn't Islam or even communism, but the American Constitution. These documents, the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution, were, in my opinion, so divinely inspired that they prophetically laid out a system of governance designed to both prevent too much government as well as preventing us from ever subjugating ourselves to an international body politic. Political power was too diversified amongst the branches of the government. The closest we came to losing this wasn't during the Civil War, but rather during the time between the Great Depression and the end of World War II. Can there be any doubt as to why God allowed the U.S. to emerge victorious after both conflicts? It wasn't because God loved the Americans more than he did anyone else. It was to prevent this New World Order, or NWO, from becoming too quickly. The NWO was stillborn with the death of Woodrow Wilson, and the League of Nations fizzled into failure. However, with the Second World War, the powers were determined to bring all the world together vis-a-vis the United Nations. And it sort of worked, except the United States could or would not subjugate itself to it. Fast forward 70 years, and I feel we are now at the end of that time of divine restraint. Which is why I keep getting this haunting sensation that we are quickly heading to another reset. Now, that is not to say we haven't had our issues in the past, because we have. But we've always managed to find a middle ground to rise up and let cooler heads prevail. However, those days are dead and gone, and the gloves are completely off. No more pretending. No more fence-sitting. No more moderate middles. The left has pushed their agenda so far to the political left, all they have left to embrace is outright wickedness. To anyone who still has a conscience, this is shocking. It is shocking to our senses and sensibilities that one party would applaud and cheer for the dismembering of unborn babies. It's shocking that one party would applaud and cheer for men pretending to be women and vice versa. It's shocking to see that they would champion anarchy and violence, so long as it's done in the name of social justice. But here we are in 2020. Generational insanity has swept the nation. What's worse is that corporate and academic America is now resourcing it. To stand against them and speak your mind means standing against a tsunami of political, corporate, economic, judicial onslaught, as well as the mob of public opinion. You're almost guaranteed to lose your job, lose your livelihood, and possibly even face jail time for disobeying the growing pockets of lawless government. And to stand with them surely means your approval of the demise of the United States, as well as abandoning the Judeo-Christian principles and the God of the Bible, which makes me think a lot about the upcoming 2020 elections. These elections seem to weigh a lot on people's minds these days, especially, as it were, George Soros, which is why he's poured millions of dollars, euros, pounds, rubles, yen, yuan, and pesos into defeating Donald J. Trump. But why? Because if you objectively look at the insanity in the world today, you'd realize we did not arrive here in a vacuum. There have been forces at play for more than a century now, who have been busily plotting and planning the demise of our biggest obstacle to world government, the United States. They know that once she falls, the rest of the Western world will fall in line with a newly empowered global system rather quickly, except with some odd men outliers like China, Russia, and Iran. More on this at the end. Nevertheless, large portions of Africa, the Americas, Europe, and parts of Asia will line up behind this new globalist powerhouse, which begs the question, What's the present holdup? Will we get another 4 years of reprieve under Trump? Or will we be handed over to the sudden destruction that will surely come at the hands of a Democratic president? Only God knows the definitive answer to that question. However, I have a few thoughts. The New World Order? The drive of the Rockefellers and their allies is to create a one-world government combining supercapitalism and communism under the same tent, all under their control. Do I mean conspiracy? Yes, I do. I am convinced there is such a plot, international in scope, generations old in planning, and incredibly evil in intent. U.S. Congressman Larry P. McDonald. For more than a century, ideological extremists at either end of the political spectrum have seized upon well-publicized incidents, such as my encounter with Castro, to attack the Rockefeller family for the inordinate influence they claim we wield over American political and economic institutions. Some even believe we are part of a secret cabal working against the best interests of the United States, characterizing my family and me as internationalists, and of conspiring with others around the world to build a more integrated global political and economic structure. One world, if you will. If that's the charge, I stand guilty, and I am proud of it. David Rockefeller, Memoirs, page 406. The New World Order is an often maligned and misused phrase that most often centers on the idea of the creation of a singular, all-powerful global government, presumably controlled by a small group of elites. It is also a phrase that is oft mocked and lauded as a conspiracy fringe idea that deserves the utmost derision. But does it? In truth, a New World Order happens quite regularly. Anytime the global power shifts from one nation or empire to another, there is, in a sense, a new world order. However, the phrase in question here is the idea of a singular, all-powerful global government. If this had originated from a bunch of loser nobodies hanging out in their parents' basement, it should be mocked. Sadly, that is not the case. The idea of a new world order, aside from being plastered to our national currency, has remained the buzz amongst the world's political, economic, and military elite for centuries. This is not some passing fad or work of science fiction, but a real thing whether we accept it or not. In other words, this idea of a new world order is a serious one and is originating from the highest echelons of power amongst the leaders of the world. Considering many of these men and women have all the wealth and resources and are seemingly well on their way to making it happen, thus, it must be taken seriously. However, the news of it, or rather, the lack of news of it, has never diminished the intrepid march towards this goal. But as history has borne out, taking the world from nationalism to globalism is not so easy a task. It took the Great War to create the League of Nations. It took the Second World War to create both the United Nations and the European Union. These globalist types know that so long as the United States remains the leader of the free world, there will be no true New World Order. This should explain by what method we have arrived at the lunacy of 2020. It has been a century-long concerted effort to A. Dumb down the population, B. Get America's youth to both hate our past and our present, C. Take control over the major institutions that control the flow of information, and D. Completely take over two major political parties. The stock market, already celebrating Trump's military success, is breaking out to reach new heights, he said, but an overheated economy can't be kept boiling too long. If all this had happened closer to the elections, it would have assured his re-election. George Soros, January 23, 2020. Notice how Soros here states this last sentence in the past tense, as if Trump's defeat is already a foregone conclusion. Mind you, this was also around the same time that the Chinese coronavirus was making its way to the United States. It's often hard to wrap our minds around the idea that our reality is not just happening in the natural order of things, but rather is being intentionally and artificially shaped to fit some agenda. like the assassinations of Lincoln, Kennedy, and King, as well as the wars of Korea, Vietnam, Afghanistan, and Iraq, events are happening that are attempting to hijack our natural trajectory. These are human-driven events that are attempting to impose some will over where the world is headed. Granted, as we expect God to do this because He is the final arbiter of human history, however, there are things happening that are not of God, events that are being shaped by men and women under the influence of dark spiritual forces, who are actively seeking the demise of the United States and to impose Satan's original world order. Now, some of you are saying, wait a minute, didn't you just write an article recently where you all but spell out the divinely inspired demise of the United States? Yes, I did. Let me clarify this seemingly juxtaposed position. Men may shape the present events, but they cannot control the outcome. God alone reserves that authority. Mankind is very much the tempest in the teapot, furious but over-exaggerated. God has the ultimate say on what and when things happen. Nevertheless, we know that according to Scripture, there is no nation like the United States mentioned in the last days. The final world superpower will come out of the boundaries of the old Roman Empire, Daniel 2 and 7 through 9. Ergo, something must happen to us between now and then that knocks us down a whole bunch of pegs. Sadly, our demise is as inevitable as the setting of the sun after a long day. We cannot prevent it, nor can we slow its approach. So if our demise is inevitable, who cares which party wins the next election? Well, primarily because we don't know when the Lord will return. If the Lord tarries another 10 to 20 years, should we suffer unnecessarily under the totalitarian machinations of the Democratic Socialist Party? A party which lauds abortion on demand, genderless children, emasculated men, invites war and terrorist attacks, and promotes the general lawlessness of anarchy on every street? Or should we occupy until He comes, as our Lord instructs us in Luke 19:13? We are to be the salt and light until He returns. Furthermore, as history has borne out, it is much easier to share the gospel when you are free than when you are under a totalitarian dictatorship. One could argue that truer converts are made during persecution, and that may be true, but each of us here today reading this were at one point converted. Is our conversion any less valid because we did it without duress? Can Christ still redeem the free man? Galatians 3:28. Even though the public opinion or awareness has waxed and waned over the past 100 years, the plan has never wavered from the globalist mind. They are continually chipping away at the U.S. so that when it gets within range of a tipping point, they can simply nudge it with a crisis. Looking back, we can see the numerous attempts to unify globalist efforts by way of crisis, creating new major political bodies. 1920, the League of Nations, Woodrow Wilson. 1921, the Council on Foreign Relations, Rockefeller since 1930. 1945, the United Nations. 1954, the Bilderberg Group. 1968, the Club of Rome, Rockefeller. 1973, the Trilateral Commission, Rockefeller. Although these are the best known, there are literally hundreds of American and European organizations dedicated to a singular global system. Powerful esoteric groups have long been involved in consolidating power into the hands of a few elite. The Vatican, the Illuminati, the Freemasons, Skull and Bones Society, National Socialists, Nazis. There are literally hundreds, if not thousands, of political groups dedicated to the globalist agenda. Following are some quotes from some of the most powerful men in the world and how they see globalism. In the next century, nations as we know it will become obsolete. All states will recognize a single global authority. National sovereignty wasn't such a great idea after all. U.S. Deputy Secretary of State Strobe Talbott, July 20th, 1992. The New World Order will have to be built from the bottom up rather than from the top down. Run around national sovereignty, eroding it piece by piece, will accomplish much more than the old-fashioned frontal assault. Richard Gardner, U.S. Counsel on Foreign Relations, Journal Foreign Affairs, April 1974. We are on the verge of a global transformation. All we need is the right major crisis, and the nations will accept the New World Order. U.S. billionaire David Rockefeller to the UN Business Conference, 1991. There are literally hundreds of quotes from many, many men advocating for a singular world government. The main difference today, as opposed to decades ago, is that the new technocracy, powerful technological corporations such as Google, Huawei, Apple, Twitter, IBM, and so forth, are piling on board the globalist bandwagon as well. They're piling on board because of how interconnected the world's economy has become in the age of information. There are hundreds of powerful technological corporations that are involved in thousands of technological efforts: data processing, artificial intelligence, unmanned autonomous systems, 5G networks, low Earth orbit satellites, Internet of Things, cloud computing, digital currency, cryptocurrency, gene editing, 3D printing, holographic technology, etc. Although many of these products and systems were designed to make our life here in the 21st century better, safer, and streamlined, these also have the potential for great and terrible abuse in the wrong hands. And according to Scripture, if we can be so bold as to read between the lines, they will be. He causes all, both small and great, rich and poor, free and slave, to receive a mark on their right hand or on their foreheads, and that no one may buy or sell except one who has the mark or the name of the beast, or the number of his name. Here is wisdom. Let him who has understanding calculate the number of the beast, for it is the number of a man. His number is 666. Revelation 13, 16 through 18. Crisis. The context. The COVID-19 crisis and the political, economic, and social disruptions it has caused is fundamentally changing the traditional context for decision-making. The inconsistencies, inadequacies, and contradictions of multiple systems, from health and financial to energy and education, are more exposed than ever amidst a global context of concern for lives, livelihoods, and the planet. Leaders find themselves at a historic crossroads, managing short-term pressures against medium and long-term uncertainties. The opportunity. As we enter a unique window of opportunity to shape the recovery, this initiative will offer insights to help inform all those determining the future state of global relations, the direction of national economies, the priorities of societies, the nature of business models, and the management of a global commons. Drawing from the vision and vast expertise of the leaders engaged across the forum's communities, the Great Reset Initiative has a set of dimensions to build a new social contract that honors the dignity of every human being. Nevertheless, we have two complementing agendas afoot. The first is incrementalism, or gradualism, which continually seeks to chip away at the foundations of a nation or empire. An example of this is the introduction of postmodernism into our public education systems. These are slow-moving agendas that ultimately aim their sights at undermining the foundation. The second is opportunism, which makes every crisis an opportunity for rapid change. There are no shortages of examples for opportunism: climate change, global warming, pandemics, financial depressions, terrorism, etc. Only a crisis, actual or perceived, produces real change. When that crisis occurs, the actions that are taken depend on the ideas that are lying around. That, I believe, is our basic function: to develop alternatives to existing policies, to keep them alive and available until the politically impossible becomes the politically inevitable. Milton Friedman. Given over. Pope Francis's 2015 encyclical letter, Laudato Si', was nothing more than a quasi-theological puff piece promoting sustainable development, UN code for depopulation, wealth distribution, global health care, and citizenry. The imminent perils of man-made climate change, as well as the virtues of globalism over nationalism. Mind you, the vicar of Christ and the so-called leader of all Christians on the earth has seemingly placed Al Gore's false predictions above God's promise, see Genesis 8:22, which tells me perhaps he's not as close to God as he seems to think. I only mention him in this article for his closing statement in the encyclical, which practically deifies Mary as the queen of creation. But because we here in the West have neglected our duties to occupy for so many decades now, the inmates are now broke out of the asylum, and still we are surprised. We should not be surprised that after decades of progressive, socialist, humanist, and Marxist indoctrination in our educational system, a generation would rise up that can no longer understand right from wrong. They can no longer differentiate between up and down or black and white. Their moral compass has all but eroded into dust and blown away by the winds of change. And God has allowed it when we kicked him out of our homes, our schools, our businesses, and our government. Thus, God is allowing this fleeting moment for the wicked to appear victorious as a means of punishment. In other words, he is restraining one form of wrath, the fire and brimstone kind, in favor of another, the wrath of abandonment, which is worse. Woe to those who fall under this form of judgment. In Romans 1:18-32, the Apostle Paul reveals to us one of the worst forms of divine judgment there is, the wrath of abandonment. This is where God gives you over to your sinful nature, and once there, you are practically guaranteeing your reservation to the lake of fire. 3 times in this passage, Paul makes mention of God giving them up and giving them over to a debased nature, unwilling and unable to come to the truth as to be saved. Are we not here as a global society yet? Public acceptance of homosexuality is the final stage of this being given over. Not only have the homosexuals come out of the closet, but they've moved in, taken over, and demanded our children as recompense. They will be moving to legalize and push for public acceptance of pedophilia next, because that is the final stage of their agenda. Today, almost every Fortune 500 company, federal institution, public university, and many churches are now kowtowing to the LGBTQ mob. Not because they care, mind you, but they fear the economic backlash from the media and from Hollywood. The new woke generation ignorantly promoted Marxism by masquerading it as equality. However, the new brown shirts are not walking around with swastikas, but with black fists and Antifa armbands. These mobs are the unofficial army of the liberal elite. Their purpose is to promote lawlessness, so that the people will demand for more authoritarian law and order. The Hegelian dialectic being played out right before our eyes. They think they are evolving into more enlightened human beings. However, their progressivist postmodernism is clouding their judgment with lies and half-truths. They are becoming a generation unable to come to the knowledge of the truth as to be saved. This has Satan's fingerprints all over it. Satan's goal, as it has been since the days of Babel, is to unite the entire world under the leadership of one man, his Antichrist. This is what drove Alexander the Great, the Romans, the Muslims, the Mongols, Napoleon, Hitler, and will one day drive the world's final ruler. The difference between the Antichrist and all those who came before him will be he finally has the technology to control the entire world. He will have the technology because corporations are feverishly whoring themselves out to create terrible systems of control that will one day fall into the wrong hands. I see in the near future a crisis approaching that unnerves me and causes me to tremble for the safety of my country. Corporations have been enthroned, and an era of corruption in high places will follow, and the money power of the country will endeavor to prolong its reign by working upon the prejudices of the people until all wealth is aggravated in a few hands and the republic is destroyed. Abraham Lincoln. The return to nationalism? When Donald J. Trump announced his candidacy on June 16, 2015, almost everyone believed he didn't have a chance. Although he had long been connected to politics, he was a Washington outsider. He was a real estate mogul. He was an author. He was a reality television star. He was a larger-than-life character who, for all intents and purposes, personified the very definition of success. Even by Barack Hussein Obama, who in 1991 stated, "I may not be Donald Trump now, but you just wait. If I don't make it, my children will." Nevertheless, as successful as Trump was, nobody took his candidacy seriously, which made his win all the more shocking and miraculous. The 2020 election, judgment or reprieve? Which brings us to today and the upcoming 2020 elections. I believe Trump will win again. Here are my practical reasons for believing this. First and foremost, what Trump was selling in 2016 resonated with the average person. We were tired of being preached at, scolded, and berated by the liberal elite for not being progressive enough. Apparently, we deplorables and bitter clingers didn't have enough common sense to recognize that men really could be women, and that Islam was a religion of peace, and that the government should run our lives. Trump was antithetical to all these points. Trump was, in effect, anti-Obama. Secondly, Americans have gotten an up-close and personal look at the version of America the Democrats are trying to sell, both in the handling of the pandemic as well as the riots and anarchy. The result? The Americans are horrified. Even liberals and Democrats are mortified at what their party is doing. The majority of Americans do not want to turn America into Chicago, Seattle, Portland, or Baltimore. Third, the Democrats have refused to offer up any substantive legislative reforms or efforts to make life better. They have literally spent the last 4 years focused on attacking Trump, Trump's family, and anyone else associated with Trump. Literally, all they have to run on as their bona fides is how much they attacked Trump. What's worse is that they have failed at that for 4 years as well. Fourth, the American public are now clearly seeing the blatant bias by the usual suspects: Hollywood, media, academics, liberals, progressives, etc. Even Americans who were not sympathetic to Trump are seeing the outlandishly ridiculous and insane nonstop attacks by elitists. Their absolute negativism and increasingly anti-Americanism is driving people toward Trump in droves. Fifth, Trump's base is more fired up now than they were in 2016, in part because he has kept his word as best he could to do the things he initially campaigned on. He kept his word. Shocking. Sixth, there's a growing number of Black Americans who are leaving the Democratic Party. Trump won 8% of the black vote in 2016. He's expected to at minimum double that in 2020. 3 polls, Emerson, Rasmussen, and Marist, have Trump at 30% or higher within the black community. In theory, if Trump even pulled half of that, he would win. This explains why we've had the left attempt to stir up race wars in the latter half of this election year. Seventh, the world has watched a relentless 4-year phony smear campaign against President Trump. It began with the outgoing administration committing political espionage and treason, and escalated into a phony impeachment. What was he impeached for again? In truth, Trump was impeached for investigating a real crime, i.e., Biden's going quid pro quo covering his son's corrupt activities in Ukraine. When that inevitably failed, the left turned and weaponized a pandemic flu in an attempt to artificially shut down Trump's booming economy. Lastly, there is an increasingly turbulent divergence growing between those who want a new world order and those who want to keep the old world order. While our president isn't the only one advocating for international nationalism, President Trump just happens to be the tippy point of the spear. Nationalism is not just an American movement, but patriots from around the world are fighting this slide into the New World Order. Conclusion. For we wrestle not against flesh and blood, but against principalities, against powers, against the rulers of the darkness of this world, against spiritual wickedness in high places. Ephesians 6:12. The politicians and power brokers with means are the ones who are using the mob to bring about the New World Order. They have embraced the ever-changing tenets of postmodern progressivism. They have embraced the delusional machinations of intersectionality and social justice. They have embraced the suicidal ideations of relativism. However, the George Soroses and David Rockefellers of the world are pawns to a much older, darker power. Clearly, there are forces at work beyond the political boundaries. Spiritual forces are moving. Demonic princes are attempting to maintain their poisonous stranglehold over their territories. The gospel is moving across enemy country with the advent of the internet and satellite television. The battlefield is aflame, and we are on the verge of a titanic shift in prophetic global geopolitics. Let us not kid ourselves. Nationalism is dead and America is gone. There's no returning to the old normal after COVID-19. While I believe that God has used imperfect men throughout history to effect change, change still came. Men like Nebuchadnezzar, Cyrus, Washington, Lincoln, Churchill, and Trump are merely designed to carry out some facet of God's plan. However, God's plan is still to let the world continue to worsen until He institutes the final crisis that drives the world together into the final beast government. Remember this one thing. From a political perspective, Donald Trump was and is the last divinely emplaced obstacle to a new one-world order. How long God chooses to allow him to be this obstacle depends. It depends on what final crisis the world needs in order to fully embrace a one-world government. Does God allow the Democrats to win in November and usher in the crisis of their making through the inability to run the most powerful nation on the planet? Or does God reserve that pleasure for Himself so that He sets the time and place of said final global crisis? My gut tells me He will retain that pleasure for Himself, and by allowing Trump to win, He has the option then to either extend His grace some more or finally bring about the great reset the world has been waiting so long for. Could it be then, during Trump's second term, that God finally calls the church home? I believe so. I believe the rapture is the great reset, and when it comes, the world is going to be turned on its head, and they will be given over to strong delusion, demanding a man, the Antichrist, come and lead them out of the greatest crisis in history. And he will lead them out of the crisis and head first into the wrath of God. Remember the former things of old, for I am God and there is no other. I am God and there is none like me, declaring the end from the beginning, and from ancient times things that are not yet done, saying, My counsel shall stand, and I will do all my pleasure. Isaiah 46, 9 and 10.